Morpurgo's The Butterfly Line. Chapter 9. A Lot of Old Codswallop. The dog was whining at the kitchen door. "Let Jack out for me, will you?" said the old lady. "There's a dear. I'll tell you what, I'll fetch the kite down Bertie made for me, shall I? You'd like to see it, wouldn't you?" And she went out. I was only too happy to let the dog out and shut the door on him. She was back sooner than I expected. "There," she said, setting the kite down on the table in front of me. "What do you think of it, then?" It was huge, much bigger than I expected, and covered in dust. It was made of brown canvas stretched over a wooden frame. All the kites I had seen had been more colourful, more flamboyant. I think it disappointed. The disappointment must have shown on my face. "She still flies, you know," she said, blowing off the dust. "You should see how she goes. You should see her." She sat down in her chair and I waited for her to begin. "Now then, where was I?" she asked. "I'm so forgetful these days." "Bertie's last letter," I said. "He was about to go off to war. But what about the White Lion, the prince? What happened to him?" I could hear the dog barking wildly outside. She smiled at me. "Everything comes to those who wait," she said. "Why don't you have a look out of the window?" I looked. The lion on the hillside was blue no more. It was white now. The dog was bounding across the hillside, chasing away a cloud of blue butterflies that rose all around him. "He chases everything he moves," she said. "But don't worry, he won't catch a single one. He never catches anything." "Not that lion," I said. "I meant the lion in the story. What happened to him?" "Don't you see, they're the same. The lion out on the hillside and the lion in the story, they're the same." "Don't understand," I said. "You soon will," she replied. "You soon will." She took a deep breath before she began again. For many years Bertie never spoke about the fighting in the trenches. He always said it was a nightmare best forgotten, best kept to himself. But later on, when he had time to reflect, when time had done its healing perhaps, then he told me something of how it had been. At 17 he'd found himself marching through the regiment along straight roads of northern France up to the front line, heads and hearts high with hope and expectation. Within a few months he was sitting huddled at the bottom of a muddy trench, hands over his head between his knees, curling himself into as tight as he could, sick with terror as the shells and whiz-bangs blew the world apart around him. Then the whistle would blow, and they'd be up and over the top, no man's land. Bayonets fixed and walking towards the German trenches, into their rat-a-tat of the machine-gun fire. To the left of him and to the right of him, his friends would fall, and he would walk on, waiting for the bullet with his name, which he knew would cut him down at any moment. At dawn, they always had to come out of their dungeons and stand to in the trenches, just in case there was an attack. The Germans often attacked at dawn. That was how, in the morning of his 20th birthday, they came swarming over no man's land, out in the early morning sun. But they were soon spotted and mowed down. Then they were turning and running. The whistle went, and Bertie led his men over the top to counter-attack. But as always, the Germans were expecting them, and the usual slaughter began. Bertie was hit in the leg and fell onto a shell hole. He thought of waiting there all day and then crawling back under the cover of darkness, but his wound was bleeding badly and he couldn't staunch it. He decided he had to try and crawl back to the trenches while he still had the strength to do it. Hugging the ground, he was almost at the wire, almost back safely, when he heard someone crying out in no man's land. It was a cry no one could ignore. He found two of his men lying side by side, so badly wounded that they could not move. One of them was already unconscious. He hoisted them onto his shoulders and made for the trenches, the bullets whipping and whining around him. The man was heavy, and Bertie fell several times under his weight, but he got himself to his feet again and staggered on. Until they tumbled down together into the trench. The stretcher-bearers tried to take Bertie away. He'd bleed to death, they said, but he would not listen. One of his own men was still lying wounded out there in no man's land, and he was going to bring him in, no matter what. Waving his hand above his head, Bertie climbed out of the trench and walked forward. The firing stopped almost at once. He was so weak himself by now that he could scarcely walk, but he managed to reach the wounded man and drag him back. They say that in the end, both sides, German and British, were up on the parapets and cheering him on as he stumbled back towards his lines. Him, and after that he didn't know any more. When he woke up, he found himself in hospital, lying in a bed, with two friends he had rescued on either side. He was still there some weeks later when he was told that he was awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery under fire. He was the hero of the hour. the pride of his regiment. Afterwards, Bertie always called it a load of old Codswallop. But to be really brave, he said, you had to overcome fear. You had to be frightened in the first place, and he hadn't been. There wasn't time to be frightened. He did what he did without thinking. Just as he had saved the White Lion Club all those years before when he was the boy in Africa. Of course, they made a great fuss of him in hospital, and he loved all that. But his leg did not heal as well as it should have done. He was still there in hospital when I found him. It was not entirely by accident I found him. For over 3 years now there had been no letter, no word from him at all. He had warned me, I know, but the long silence was so hard to bear. Every time the postman came, I hoped, and the pang of disappointment was sharper each time when there was no letter. I told all to Nanny Mason, who dried my tears and told me to pray, and that she would too. She was sure there'd be a letter soon. Without Nanny, I don't know how long I'd gone on living. I was so miserable. I'd seen the wounded men coming back from France, blinded, gassed, crippled, and always dreaded seeing Bertie's face among them. I'd seen the long list in the newspapers of all the missing who'd been killed or were missing. I looked every day for his name, and thanked God every time I didn't find it. But still, he never wrote. And I had to know why. I thought maybe he'd been so badly wounded he couldn't write. That he was lying in a hospital somewhere alone and unloved. I was so determined I would become a nurse. I would go to France and heal and comfort as best I could, and just hope that somehow I might find him. But I soon discovered that amongst so many men in uniform it would be hopeless to look for him. I didn't even know his regiment or rank. I had no idea where to begin. I was sent to a hospital some 50 miles behind the lines, not far from the Amiens. The hospital was a converted chateau with turrets and great wide staircases and chandeliers in the wards. It was so cold in the winter that many of the men died as the cold from their wounds. We did as best as we could for them. We were short on doctors and short on medicines. There were always so many men coming in. Each time we saved one of them, it was such a joy. I was at breakfast one morning. It was June of 1918. I was reading a magazine, the Illustrated London News. I remember when I turned the page and I saw a face I knew at once. He was older, thinner than the face, and unsmiling, but I'm sure it was Bertie. His eyes were deep-set and gentle, just as I remembered them. And there was his name, Captain Albert Andrews, B.C. There was a whole article underneath about what he'd done and how he was still recovering from his wounds in hospital. A hospital that turned out to be a little more than 10 miles away. Wild horses would not keep me from him. The next Sunday I cycled over. He was sleeping when I first saw him, propped up on pillows, one hand behind his head. "Hello," I said. He opened his eyes and frowned at me. It was a moment or two before he knew me. "Been in the wars, have you?" I said. "Something like that," he replied.